In 2019, there were almost 9,000 dairy farms in Britain. Today, there are 7,000. That's not a slow decline. That's 2 farms closing every single day, quietly, while the milk on your supermarket shelf never runs out. So where's all that milk coming from? And who's actually paying the price for keeping it cheap? To understand what's happening to British dairy, you have to start with a number that sounds almost too simple to matter, but it explains everything. Farmers today are being paid somewhere between 32 and 35 pence for every litre of milk they produce. Producing that same litre costs them somewhere between 42 and 49 pence. That means for every single litre a dairy farmer sells, they are losing money before they've even opened the shop door. Not a small loss either. On a mid-sized farm producing 5,000 litres a day, that gap works out to roughly £750 lost every day just from doing business as usual. Multiply that across a year, across thousands of farms, and you start to understand why the exits are happening so fast. This isn't even the first time this has happened. Go back to 2015 and you'll find almost the exact same headlines. A price war between major supermarkets pushed milk down to record lows on the shelf, and dairy farmers were being forced out of business at a rate of roughly 2 a day, the same grim rhythm we're seeing again now, over a decade later. Back then, the story was framed almost entirely around supermarkets undercutting each other to sell milk as a loss leader, a product cheap enough to pull shoppers through the door with the difference quietly absorbed by squeezing the price paid to farmers. The fact that we're here again, more than 10 years on, with a different set of immediate causes but the same underlying result, tells you this isn't a one-off shock. It's a structural weakness in how the entire supply chain is built, one that keeps resurfacing under slightly different conditions every few years, because nothing about the fundamental power imbalance has actually changed. It wasn't always like this, and that's part of what makes the story so painful. Go back to the start of 2025, and the picture looked almost hopeful. Farmgate prices were sitting around 45.5 pence a litre in January, the strongest milk-to-feed ratio the industry had seen since 2007. For a brief window, dairy farming actually made sense as a business. Farmers did what any rational business owner would do when the numbers finally worked in their favor. They invested, they expanded herds, they pushed production higher. Output rose roughly 5% over the year, and in May, a genuinely staggering 39 million litres of milk were tankered off British farms in a single day, a national record. It should have been a turning point for the industry. Instead, it became the beginning of the collapse. Here's the cruel irony. The very success that gave farmers hope is what triggered the crash. Because it wasn't just happening in Britain. Farmers across Europe, the United States, and Oceania were riding the same wave of strong prices, and they all responded the same way by producing more. All of that extra milk landed in the global market at roughly the same time, creating what industry insiders now grimly call a wall of milk. Processing plants, already running near capacity, couldn't absorb it. Wholesale prices for butter and cheddar, the products that soak up surplus milk, began collapsing through the autumn. And once wholesale prices fall, farmgate prices follow almost immediately, because processors simply pass the pain straight down the supply chain to the people with the least power to resist it, the farmers themselves. From October onwards, processors began cutting the price they paid farmers, again and again, in a drumbeat that farmers describe as relentless. Some contracts, the ones not tied to a guaranteed floor price, were hit especially hard. Farmers watched prices that had comfortably covered their costs at the start of the year fall to levels that didn't even cover feed and fuel by winter. And just as the industry braced for what's known as the spring flush, the seasonal surge in milk production every year as more cows calve, nature added its own layer of chaos. 2026 delivered 3 separate heat waves in May, June, and July, each one pushing UK temperatures above 35 degrees Celsius for the first time on record. To understand why that matters for dairy, you need to understand a basic biological fact about cows. Heat stress causes them to eat less and rest less, and both of those things directly reduce how much milk they produce and how rich that milk is. The most severe of those heat waves, a record 37.7 degrees in late June, pushed national output nearly 3% below the 5-year average at its peak. In a system already this fragile, that was enough to send prices swinging wildly in the opposite direction, briefly spiking from below 20 pence a litre to between 38 and 48 pence, before settling back down as supply recovered. It is, if you strip away the human cost for a moment, a genuinely remarkable case study in how thin the buffer really is between glut and shortage. A few weeks of extreme weather in either direction is enough to swing the entire market. But farmers can't run their businesses on a few weeks of extreme weather. They need stability across years, not spikes across seasons. And stability is exactly what this industry has stopped offering them. So who is actually catching this instability? Not the supermarkets, not the processors. It's the farmers sitting at the very bottom of a very long supply chain, with the least ability to pass costs upward and the least protection when prices fall. And this is where the story stops being about weather and global supply and starts being about power. Consider what happens to a block of cheese after it leaves the farm. Research has found that a typical 480-gram pack of mild cheddar, the kind sitting on supermarket shelves right now for around £2.50, leaves the farm that produced the milk inside it with less than a penny of profit. Some more recent analysis puts the number even lower, closer to 1/20th of a penny. Read that again. A farmer spends a year feeding, milking, and caring for a herd of cows, taking on debt, working 7 days a week, exposed to weather, disease, and market swings that can wipe out a season's income overnight. And at the end of that entire process, when a customer buys a pack of cheese made from that milk, the farmer's share of that transaction is smaller than the coin you'd find on the back of a sofa cushion. Where does the rest of that money go? It moves through processors, the companies that turn raw milk into branded products, and then through retailers, who set the shelf price and decide what promotions to run. Major processors like Arla supply branded milk to household name supermarkets and also produce well-known butter brands. Other processors make some of the most recognizable cheddar brands sold across nearly every major supermarket in the country. These companies sit in the middle of the chain, and in a system where farmers are absorbing losses, some of these processors and retailers continue to report solid profits. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's simply how the current structure of the supply chain distributes risk and reward. Farmers carry almost all of the risk. They get almost none of the reward. And here's the part that makes so many people angry once they actually understand it. While farmers are losing money on every liter, the price shoppers pay in supermarkets hasn't dropped anywhere close to the same degree. If the market truly reflected the collapse happening at the farm gate, milk and cheese should be getting noticeably cheaper on the shelf. For the most part, they haven't. Retail prices have stayed comparatively stable, even as farm gate prices have fallen by up to 40% in the space of months. That gap between what's happening at the start of the supply chain and what shoppers actually experience at the till is exactly where the missing money has gone. It hasn't vanished. It's simply being captured somewhere between the farm gate and the checkout, by processors managing their own margins and by retailers protecting theirs, while the only party without the leverage to protect anything is the one actually producing the raw product everyone else is profiting from. A leading professor of food policy has put it bluntly, saying the consuming public would be genuinely shocked to learn just how low returns on dairy farming actually are. He argues the entire sector has been locked into what he calls an environmentally and strategically undesirable drive for scale, where the only way for a farm to survive squeeze margins is to get bigger, milk more cows, and chase efficiency at an industrial level. Some farmers have tried to escape this trap altogether, building shorter supply chains, selling milk directly to the public, focusing on quality and welfare rather than volume. It's a genuine alternative, and for some farms, it works. But it comes at a cost. Products from these smaller, higher welfare, more transparent operations are inevitably more expensive, and in a cost of living crisis, that pricing puts them at a disadvantage against supermarket shelves stacked with cheap, volume-produced alternatives. The market, in other words, rewards exactly the kind of farming that's driving the crisis, and punishes the kind of farming that might actually solve it. This is the deeper truth behind the phrase you'll hear again and again from farming unions. Farmers without contracts tied to their actual cost of production, contracts negotiated with major supermarket groups that guarantee a floor price regardless of what the wholesale market is doing, are the ones most likely to be losing money right now. In other words, whether a farm survives this crisis or not increasingly depends less on how well it's run and more on whether it happened to sign the right contract with the right buyer at the right time. That's not a market rewarding efficiency. That's a market rewarding proximity to power. And the numbers on the ground reflect exactly that. In the southwest of England, one of the country's traditional dairy heartlands, farmers are currently receiving around 34 pence a litre, while their actual costs sit above 40 pence. The National Farmers Union has been explicit about the causes. Ongoing conflict in the Middle East has driven up fuel, feed, and fertilizer costs across the entire agricultural sector, squeezing farmers from the input side at exactly the same moment they're being squeezed from the output side by collapsing prices. It's a pincer movement, rising costs on one side, falling revenue on the other, and farmers caught directly in the middle with nowhere to move. The chairman of one regional farming board, an active dairy producer himself, has warned that livestock businesses can only absorb losses like this for a very limited period before something breaks. And it already has, for many. Multiple independent dairy operators across the Southwest have exited the industry entirely in recent months, selling off herds that, in some cases, represented generations of careful breeding, and liquidating assets that took decades to build. This isn't abstract industry data. It's family businesses, some of them going back 3 or 4 generations, ending not because the people running them lacked skill or dedication, but because the economics of the system they were operating in made survival mathematically impossible. Take one farming family in Shropshire, on the border with Cheshire, running 200 pedigree Holstein cows across a 175-acre farm. They expect to lose money this year, despite doing everything right, despite decades of experience, despite genuinely excellent animal husbandry. As one of them put it plainly, it's simply a matter of too much milk in the market. Not bad farming, not bad luck in the traditional sense, not poor planning, and not a failure of ambition either. Just an oversupplied market where prices have fallen below what it costs anyone to produce, regardless of how well, how carefully, or how efficiently they run their operation. Consider another farm, this one in Sussex, run by a man named Matthew Ford. Like so many others, his business is caught in the same squeeze of rising costs and shrinking margins, but for him, the deeper worry isn't even this year's milk price. It's the direction policy seems to be heading more broadly, changes to land access and support schemes that make it harder to plan more than a season or two ahead. That's a theme that comes up again and again when you actually talk to the people running these farms. It's rarely just one single problem. It's milk prices this year, feed costs the year before, a policy change the year after that, each one manageable in isolation, but compounding into something that eventually becomes unsustainable when they arrive together, one on top of another, without enough good years in between to rebuild any kind of financial cushion. And this is happening against a backdrop of genuine long-term change in the industry's structure. The total number of dairy farmers in Britain has fallen roughly 20% since 2019, down to around 7,000 active operations today, according to the Agriculture and Horticulture Development Board. That's not a story of the industry shrinking overall, because total milk production has actually kept climbing, forecast to reach a near-record 13 billion litres this year. What's actually happening is consolidation. Fewer farms, but bigger ones. Smaller family operations closing their gates for the last time, while larger, more intensive operations absorb their market share. Investigative reporting has documented a rise in what critics call battery cattle farms, large-scale, highly intensive dairy operations that some argue represent the only viable business model left under current market conditions. Whether you see that as sensible modernization or as the loss of something genuinely valuable in British farming probably depends on where you're standing. But either way, it's the direction the numbers are pushing the entire industry. It's worth pausing here to ask an obvious question. If farmers are losing money on every liter, why do they keep producing? Why not simply stop? The honest answer is that dairy farming doesn't work like flipping a switch. Cows need to be milked twice a day, regardless of what price that milk fetches, for welfare reasons as much as anything else. A herd represents years, sometimes decades, of breeding and investment that can't simply be paused and restarted when prices improve. Selling off a herd is often an irreversible decision, the end of a business rather than a pause in one. So farmers keep milking, keep absorbing losses month after month, hoping that prices recover before their reserves run out, because the alternative, selling everything and walking away, is final in a way that continuing to lose money painfully isn't. That's the trap so many farmers currently find themselves in. Not ignorance of their own losses, full awareness of them, and no good option to escape. This is also why the industry has become such a case study in boom and bust, and why that pattern seems to be accelerating rather than easing. In under a year, according to industry analysts, the sector swung from crippling oversupply and collapsing prices to a genuine supply squeeze during the summer heat waves, and back again as autumn approached. That kind of volatility might be manageable for a large corporation with cash reserves and diversified income. For a family farm operating on thin margins, even in a good year, it's close to unmanageable. You cannot plan feed purchases, staffing, or investment decisions around a market that might swing 30 pence a litre in either direction within a few months. And underneath both the boom and the bust, there's a quieter, longer-term shift happening too. Consumer demand is steadily moving toward high-protein products, changing what actually sells well at the retail end, and reshaping what growth even looks like for an industry trying to plan years ahead in a market that currently can't be predicted more than a season out. So where does responsibility actually sit in all of this? It's tempting and understandable to point a single finger at supermarkets and call it a day. And they are undeniably part of the story, given how little of the final retail price actually reaches the farm gate, and given how much leverage they hold in every negotiation with processors. But the full picture is more tangled than a single villain. Global oversupply, driven by farmers across multiple continents, all responding rationally to a brief window of strong prices, is a structural problem, not a supermarket decision. Extreme weather, arriving with a severity and frequency that's becoming the new normal rather than the exception, is not something any retailer controls. Rising input costs tied to global conflict and energy markets sit well outside any single company's boardroom. What supermarkets and large processors are responsible for is how the pain gets them distributed once all of these pressures hit the system. And on that point, the evidence is fairly consistent. The party with the least negotiating power, the individual farmer, absorbs the most risk, while the parties with the most power, the processors and retailers who set final prices and can spread losses across enormous product portfolios, are far better insulated. There have been attempts to address this imbalance directly. Regulations introduced in recent years were designed specifically to improve fairness and transparency across the dairy supply chain, requiring clearer contracts and, in theory, giving farmers more predictable, including from opposition politicians, for something stronger, a government-backed minimum milk price that would guarantee farmers a floor regardless of what global markets are doing. Whether that's the right solution is genuinely debatable and comes with its own complications around trade rules and market distortion. But the fact that it keeps being raised again and again by people across the political spectrum tells you something important. The current system, as it stands, is widely seen as failing the people producing the actual food. There's also a quieter regulatory piece to this story that rarely makes headlines but matters just as much. Watchdogs exist specifically to police how supermarkets treat their suppliers, with the power to investigate unfair practices and enforce fairer dealing across grocery supply chains. In theory, that oversight should stop exactly the kind of imbalance dairy farmers describe. In practice, farmers and campaigners argue enforcement hasn't kept pace with how the pressure actually gets applied. It's rarely one dramatic broken rule that gets recorded and punished. It's 1,000 small pressures instead, a contract renewed on slightly worse terms, a promotion demanded at short notice, a payment delayed by a few extra weeks, none of them severe enough on their own to trigger a formal complaint, but devastating in combination over the course of a difficult year. That's the uncomfortable reality of power imbalances in any supply chain. They rarely announce themselves. They just quietly determine who survives and who doesn't. And there's a real cost to allowing that failure to continue, one that goes well beyond any individual farming family, however painful those individual stories are. The dairy sector contributes more than £6 billion a year to the British economy and accounts for roughly 1/5 of the country's entire agricultural output. That's not a niche corner of the food system. That's a foundational pillar of it. Every farm that closes doesn't just represent a personal tragedy for the family involved, real as that is. It represents a small, permanent shift in Britain's capacity to produce its own food, a slow erosion of food security that becomes far harder to notice day to day than it is to reverse once it's gone. Farmland doesn't return to dairy production overnight once a herd has been sold and the infrastructure dismantled. Knowledge and skill built up across generations of a single family doesn't transfer easily to whoever eventually buys the land. When a dairy farm closes, in most cases, it closes for good. There's also a generational dimension to this that deserves real attention. Across the country, farmers with children who want to enter the industry are increasingly discouraging them from doing so, not because they don't want the tradition to continue, but because they genuinely cannot see a viable financial future in it under current conditions. One Somerset dairy farmer, watching his own sons hope to follow him into the business, has spoken openly about his fear that the next generation will simply walk away if profitability doesn't improve soon. That's arguably the most sobering part of this entire story. It's not just about the roughly 2,000 farms that have already closed since 2019. It's about the farms that will never even get started, the young people who look at the economics of dairy farming today and quietly decide to do something else with their lives instead. An industry can survive a difficult year. It struggles to survive an entire generation deciding it isn't worth entering in the first place. So, what does the road ahead actually look like? Industry forecasters are cautious, and for good reason, because this sector has proven itself capable of swinging sharply in either direction within a matter of months. Some analysts expect continued price pressure through the remainder of this year, as global supply remains elevated and demand growth struggles to keep pace with it. Others point to the summer heat waves as early evidence that climate volatility could increasingly work in farmers' favor by periodically constraining supply and pushing prices back upward, even if that relief tends to arrive for uncomfortable reasons and never lasts particularly long. What almost everyone agrees on is that the era of predictable, stable milk prices, the kind that let a farming family plan 5 or 10 years ahead with any real confidence, appears to be over, at least for now. Farmers are increasingly being advised to build financial resilience directly into their businesses, forecasting cash flow carefully, engaging proactively with lenders and banks before problems become emergencies, and treating volatility as the new baseline rather than as some temporary disruption they simply need to wait out. That shift in mindset from expecting stability to actively managing volatility tells you almost everything about where this industry currently stands. It's not just weathering one difficult year, it's being asked to fundamentally restructure how it operates, to survive as a permanent feature of the market rather than a passing storm. Some farms will manage that transition. Larger operations with more capital, better access to credit, and the scale to absorb short-term losses are far more likely to still be standing 5 years from now. Smaller family farms, the ones without deep reserves or the newest, most cost-tied contracts, face a much harder road, and many of them, if current trends continue unbroken, simply won't be there when the market eventually settles into a new normal. There is one factor in all of this that shoppers themselves actually have some influence over, even if it rarely feels that way standing in a supermarket aisle. Retailers respond to demand signals, and demand signals are shaped, at least in part, by what customers choose to buy and what they're willing to pay for it. Products carrying clearer commitments to fair, cost-covering prices for farmers do exist on British shelves, even if they're not always the cheapest option in the fridge. Choosing them consistently won't fix a global oversupply problem on its own, and nobody should pretend it will. But it does send a small, steady signal up through the supply chain that fair pricing has commercial value, not just ethical value. And that's a signal retailers do eventually respond to when it's loud and consistent enough over time. It's a slow lever, not a fast one, and it won't save every farm currently on the brink. But paired with stronger contracts, real regulatory teeth, and honest conversations about what food is actually worth to produce, it's part of a genuine path forward rather than simply managing a slow, permanent decline. So the next time you pick up a 2-pound bottle of milk or a block of cheddar for £2.50, it's worth remembering what that price actually represents, and just as importantly, what it doesn't represent. It doesn't represent the true cost of producing that food. It represents a price shaped by global oversupply, by extreme weather events becoming more frequent by the year, by a supply chain where the people taking on the most risk hold the least power to negotiate, and by a retail environment where keeping shelf prices low remains one of the most powerful competitive weapons a supermarket has. Somewhere behind that low price sits a farmer, quite possibly losing money on every single liter they sell, hoping the market turns before their reserves run dry and increasingly uncertain whether there will be a next generation ready and willing to take over when they eventually can't continue. British dairy isn't collapsing because farmers have suddenly forgotten how to farm. It's collapsing because a system built on razor-thin margins, global oversupply, extreme and worsening weather, and deeply unequal bargaining power has finally reached a point where the people actually producing the milk can no longer absorb the losses being pushed down onto them. 2 farms are still closing every day, and behind each one of those closures sits a real family, a real herd, and a piece of the countryside that won't easily return to dairy once it's gone. Unless something meaningful changes in how risk and reward are actually shared across this supply chain, that number isn't going to slow down anytime soon.